Good morning, and thank you for joining us. This is a part of a series of webinars where we at MassINC and the MassINC Polling Group examine the findings of COVID-19 public opinion research on distinct policy areas. I'm Juana Matias, COO of MassINC, and today we'll be talking about new data from a survey conducted by the MassINC Polling Group. It comes as schools and parents across the state begin the school year by navigating either remote, in person, or hybrid learning amid an ever-evolving health crisis. After a presentation of the poll results, we will have a question and answer portion. So please feel free to use the chat function and submit your questions. Maeve Duggan, Research Director at the MassINC Polling Group, will be fielding some of your questions in real time in the chat, and others will be answered at the end of our event during our question and answer portion. But first, it's my pleasure to introduce our presenter who will be breaking down results from the statewide survey of K-12 parents in Massachusetts, Steve Koczela, president of the MassINC Polling Group. Steve, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Juana, and thank you for the introduction. I'd also offer thanks here at the top of the program to the Barr Foundation, who sponsored the survey that we're going to be discussing today. I'd also offer thanks to the good folks at the Ed Trust, who were instrumental in helping us design the questionnaire and really put this project together. And also my colleague, Maeve Duggan, one of the research directors here at the MassINC Polling Group, who was also worked on this poll with me. She is in the Zoom here also and would be glad to answer questions that you submit during the presentation, and we'll also have quite a bit of time afterwards to answer any questions that people may have. So with that, I will go ahead and share my screen. I've got some slides that walk us through some of the highlights of the results today, and we'll just get going. So this is the second in a series of surveys that we've done. The first one was done in May and June, where we looked at how things were going at the end of last school year. This one was done in sort of mid to late October and ran right over into November, and is the second wave of kind of the series. We also then will have two more waves of this survey that will be done at other points throughout the school year, as well as some focus groups. So there are some things that this poll we didn't cover in this poll that we do really hope to be able to cover in polls that are to come. So lots more to come. And if you have ideas or thoughts about things that we should be covering or things you'd like to know more about, please do send them to us, because we're going to be designing that poll in the time coming up. So what is the poll that we're talking about today? The poll today is a survey of just over 1,500 parents of K-12 students in Massachusetts. That's about the same sample size as the one that we did back in May and June, and it was done in a similar kind of way. Basically, we did a base sample of parents across Massachusetts, basically a statewide representative sample of K-12 parents. And then to that, we added oversamples of Black parents, Latino parents, and Asian parents, so that we had 250, roughly 250 in each group, so that we could break out both to look at each one of those groups as a whole, and then also actually to be able to even drill down within demographic groups, within, for instance, Black parents who are in a hybrid situation or in a remote situation, Latino parents in different income categories, and so forth. So the oversampling, I think, really added a richness to the first wave of the survey. And as you'll see, there's some very interesting differences that we were able to bring to light because of the robustness of the sample that was done for this survey as well. So the survey was conducted in, like I said, October 16th and November 1st. We did it both telephone and online, English and Spanish. And what the overall numbers that you'll be looking at is a representative sample of the entire state. We do also break things down into demographic groups, but when you're looking at the results as a whole, it's basically, think about it as school parents. That's kind of the frame that you should be considering when you're interpreting the results that we're looking at. And as I mentioned, huge thanks to the Barr Foundation for sponsorship and the Education Trust for their help. So just a little bit about what we found, and then we'll dive into the numbers. One of the things we wanted to do with this poll was just understand at a basic level who's actually doing what. How many people are in hybrid? How many people are in remote? Who's in person? And who's doing pods? Who's hired a tutor? All the different things that parents are doing. It used to be the case that we could kind of figure out what the school situation was with about maybe two questions. What grade is your child in? And are they in a public district school, a charter school, private school, and so forth? Now it's 8, maybe there were 10 or 12 questions. I don't know exactly how many it took, but there's a lot of questions that it takes this year to even figure out what parents are doing. So what we found was that the large majority say that they're either in a hybrid or a fully remote model. And there's some very interesting differences in terms of what parents think about those models and which ones parents that are in those models give different ratings to. For instance, one of the things that this poll found, which was very interesting and kind of surprising to me, was that the reactions to hybrid were more negative than reactions to remote. Specifically looking at things like whether your child's falling behind, what the academic and social, emotional, and mental health consequences may be for your child of this year, all were lower for parents who are in a hybrid, of children who are in a hybrid situation. So we'll dig into that a little bit as we move through the numbers. Another interesting thing, the number one factor that parents were thinking about in terms of considering different formats was health and safety. So obviously, there's a lot of things that are really hard to weigh against one another these days. There's the decisions that we've all been making in everyday life, the decisions that we've been making about who to see, who not to see, where to go, where not to go, are all very tough. And so one of the things we wanted to do is just see what parents were thinking about specifically when they were contemplating school for the year ahead. And then just in terms of impacts, we took a look at that as well and found by and large parents view the impact as negative. There are some things that we'll look at that change that a little bit, but there's certainly many more parents that see a negative impact than a positive impact. One of the things that did make reactions a bit more positive were any supplementing or changing of your situation you could do, like if you were in a pod, if you hired a tutor, if you changed schools, and that sort of thing. Interestingly, on pods, they, as we all know, received a lot of media and a lot of policy attention at the beginning of the school year. One of the concerns, of course, was that they would be something that exacerbated inequities that are already very wide. But what we found is that they're both less common than we would have thought, and that there are not big socioeconomic and racial disparities in terms of parents who say that their kids are participating in a pod. So two very interesting things about that. A couple comparisons then between the May and June survey and the one that we just completed. Not surprisingly, I think, but it does show up very starkly. More parents now see their children as behind grade level, and that extends again across socioeconomic groupings, across the race groupings that we surveyed as a part of this survey. We also compared ELL and IEP services to who has access to it and who sees them as sufficient. And in both cases, more parents now have access to them, but only ELL services were seen as having improved, while IEP services, more students have access, but now more parents see them as inadequate. Another thing that did improve was device access. That was something that a lot of attention was paid to after the last survey, and there was a lot of attention at the district level, at the school level, from foundations and philanthropy and so forth. And it does seem like there has been improvement in terms of the percentage of students that have access to the devices that they need. Internet, on the other hand, has not really improved. And one of the reasons for that is what we were asking was that, this is my interpretation of it anyway, is what we were asking is, do you have sufficient internet? Do you have enough for what you need to be doing? And with so many students doing multiple hours per day of live streaming, essentially, the requirements for internet are much higher than they were in the spring survey, when a lot of it was remote. A lot of it was downloading materials, doing them, and then sending them back in, rather than participating in hours and hours of live online classes each day. So a couple caveats before we dive into the data, or just a couple things to keep in mind. First and foremost, just a reminder that this survey data is perception data. It's expectation data. It is not assessment data. It is not achievement data. So for instance, when we're looking at hybrid versus remote, it's possible that when all is said and done, it will turn out that hybrid, was better, that assessment scores are higher. We don't know that because we don't have that kind of data, but just do bear in mind that this is all how parents are reacting to what they're seeing. It is not, what kind of grades their kids are getting or anything like that. The other thing is just that there's a lot of shades of gray on the stuff we're going to be talking about, particularly in terms of formatting formats, school formats. I mean, think of all the parents you know and all the slightly different things that they're doing or very different things that they're doing. You know, we put things in the buckets that we could, but again, there just are a lot of different things that parents are doing. And the other thing is that it's already changing a lot. We'll see in the survey that a lot of people have already changed the formats that they're participating in, but that's going to continue. And that is probably, I mean, even as we were doing the survey, there were a lot of school districts who were starting back up with hybrid, for instance, for certain grade levels. So this is something that's going to be changing a lot, which is one of the reasons I'm glad we're going to continue doing these surveys. But when we did this survey, what we found was that 46% said that they did both, they had a child in remote, 46% said they had a child in hybrid, and just 11% said they had a child in in-person instruction. This does not add perfectly to 100, as sharp and eagle-eyed observers have probably already taken note of, and that's because parents have, in many cases, children in more than one of these formats. So that's why that is. But the basic message is that remote and hybrid are by far the most common. The follow-up question, though, is who's doing which one? And there are big differences there. So starting off with what demographic groups say they're doing all remote school. There's a lot of demographic groups here, but you can kind of just get a sense if you look up at the top and if you look down at the bottom, kind of how it breaks down. Excuse me. So the two groups most likely to say, for parents to say that their children are in a all remote schooling situation are Latino parents with household incomes under 75,000 and Black parents with household incomes under 75,000. We also see families that speak Spanish at home. We see charter parents, parents in urban areas, gateway city parents, and so forth. So and then you look down at the bottom and you've got the groups that are the least likely to say that their children are in an all remote schooling situation are parents with kids in private schools, white upper income parents, parents with college degrees, Catholic school parents, outside gateway cities and so forth. So you can kind of just look at who's at which end of this chart and see that there are big divides, big socioeconomic divides, big racial divides in terms of who is doing what kind of schooling. We'll see in a little while that it's not necessarily that people want to move to one or the other format, but we should just note that this is what's happening. This is the current situation. So as we start to learn more about what the impacts are of these formats, then this is these next couple slides show kind of who's doing what. So then looking next at hybrid, this shows which parents say that their child is currently in a hybrid situation. And you can see that it's basically the reverse, where you've got private school parents, parents with advanced degrees, upper income parents, and so forth up at the top, white families and Black families with incomes over 75,000, and Asian families are right there. Then you look down at the very bottom and you've got, basically it's the families who are most likely to say that they were in a in-person model are the least likely to say they're in hybrid. So there is this big divide that I think we're going to be learning a lot more about as time goes on in terms of what the impacts of this are. But one of the things we wanted to do with the survey is, because there is no official data on this yet, we just wanted to document who is actually doing what and how does that actually break down. And then finally, in person, it's not very many people, as you can see here. Most of the groups, most of the demographic groups, it's at or less than 10% who say that they're in this situation. But Catholic and private school parents, particularly, the most likely to say that their children are learning in person. And one of the things that we found is that this is a lot of the people who have switched their format, or who switched schools rather, was to get this kind of in-person format. Oh, this is from another survey, but one of the things that we found consistently throughout this survey was that it's not necessarily that hybrid parents would prefer to be in, that remote parents would prefer to be in hybrid. It's not that there's a preference, kind of a single direction preference where parents think more in person is better. This was from an EdChoice survey that was done in October, and looking at the data, what we found in it was that support levels for each of these three different formats, which is what these bars show that support for remote, which is that light blue set of bars there, is actually the highest among Black, Latino, and Asian parents. So it's not, there is a big divide, but there's definitely a question as to what everybody would do if they had a full set of choices. We also then, looking further at the impact of hybrid, we found that there was a Pew Research Center poll that was done, which is what is shown here on this next slide. And the numbers here show the percentage of K-12 parents who think that their child I'm sorry, let me start that again. It's the percentage of K-12 parents who are either very or somewhat concerned that their child is falling behind as a result of COVID disruptions. And looking at the bottom set of bars in this chart there on the right, what you see is that your in-person parents are the least worried. Your remote, which is that second bar, online instruction only, are second. And the most worried are your hybrid parents. So this confirms some of or I shouldn't say confirms, but at least echoes some of the things that we're going to see in our survey a little bit later. So we've looked at kind of who's doing what, but then the impact of who's doing what is not clear, at least when you look just at what parents are saying. Again, this is not assessment data, this is perception data. So then it's worth considering what other choices parents actually had. Now, some of this is already, it's changing already as schools kind of shut down for in-person instruction or reopen hybrid and so forth. So, but this was basically what options did you have or what options were available in your child's district. And you can see that among the 11%, that column there on the left, who say they were doing in person, about half of them said they could have done remote, and the rest were divided between either hybrid or they had no other choices. But then looking at what most people are doing, the remote or the hybrid, which you've got 46% doing either one. Your remote parents said about half of them said they could have chosen hybrid, but 41% said that was it, that was my only choice. And then among your hybrid parents, most of them said that they only could have really chosen remote. So not very many people said that they could have chosen in person. So there's already been a fair amount of upheaval, and this was, again, extending through, starting in mid-October and going through early November. And just in the last few weeks, as we all know, there's been a lot of change to school districts across the country. But basically, as of when we did this survey, about a fifth of parents, 22%, said that their child's school format had already changed. Among those, that set of numbers at the bottom, just about a third, 35%, said that their child had moved to in-person instruction. Half said that they had gone from something else into remote only, and 13% said that their child had moved into a hybrid model. 13% of this relatively small group. So I would guess that these numbers are quite a bit higher already. If we were to put the survey back in the field now, you'd probably see that many more parents said that their child's school format had changed. You'll recall, for instance, that in a lot of districts they had, for instance, there was going to be hybrid, but it was delayed somewhat, and this school year started remotely, for instance. So there's a lot of this kind of thing that was going on even when we did the survey, and I think this is a number which will only increase as time goes on. So what mattered? What kind of factors were parents actually thinking about? That was the question here. And what we found was that health and safety was the thing that parents mentioned the most often. 50% said health and safety, and the next thing was academic and learning opportunities. But the number one thing that's up there was health and safety, which again, as we're thinking about like, what do parents want? How are they reacting to what they are offered? Even though they think that impacts are negative, what can we take from that? Just one thing to keep in mind is that health and safety is the number one issue on parents' minds. So then we looked at, okay, well, let's break that down a little bit. What was the number one thing on parents of public school, kids in public schools right now versus charter versus Catholic, I should say district public, charter, Catholic, and private. And let's just kind of take them one by one. So starting with the sort of dark red line there, that's public school parents. And you can see that health and safety is right up there, sticks just kind of jutting out there at the top. And then just what the district offered. This was, You'll recall that in many cases there wasn't a lot of choice, so it was people both wanted to stay home and be safe, and also that was all that the school district was offering. But then when you compare that to what Catholic and private school parents were, there you see kind of jutting out to the right the perception of Catholic and private school parents that that academic and learning opportunities, or they rated those more highly. And sticking off there to the left, socialization was also something of particular importance to the Catholic school parents that we surveyed here. We also did the same thing then for who chose what format here on the next slide. So this is in-person versus remote versus hybrid, and we also added a couple more factors here. So starting with your remote only, this I think also helps to tell the story of kind of when we're thinking about remote versus hybrid and some of the things that are on parents' minds about each one. Health and safety was by far the most important thing to parents who are in a remote situation at this point. Hybrid parents, that dark blue bar, had a few more things that they mentioned. Also, academic and learning opportunities stuck out up there, and at the bottom, opportunities for kids to socialize. And then in person, it was kind of a mix of things. You know, they kind of selected each one of the things with closer to equal importance, but also a few more of them, though not by any means the majority, selected work or mentioned work and work schedules and childcare as things that led them to that to those decisions. Okay, so a further question about who's doing what isn't just what format you're in, but all the different things that people are doing at home to try to as a part of their child's education this year. So overall, 15% said that their children were in a pod. That's the dark red bar all the way on the left. And then it's more at younger grade levels. So the next three bars kind of break it down by K to 4, 5th to 8th, and 9th to 12th. And you can see that for pods, and actually for each of the other two sets of bars also, there's this kind of stair step down where your youngest kids are the most likely to be in one of these kinds of situations. But in each case, it's relatively unusual. You know, these are all things where we didn't see even close to a majority, not even a quarter of parents say that they're doing any one of these things. So focusing then specifically on pods for just a minute, one of the questions, like I mentioned at the beginning, was just what role are pods going to play on exacerbating any inequities that exist already? So overall, the number was 15% of parents that are in a pod. But then how does that break down? And this is one of the places where being able to having been able to do oversampling really made a huge difference. And what we found was that there's just not a big difference between the percentage of white parents who say they're in some kind of situation like this versus Black, Latino, and Asian parents. And also not a huge difference by income. It doesn't appear from this survey that this is something that only wealthy white parents have been able to do. We also then compared this to a national poll. There was a poll by Echelon Insights and National Parents United that found 14% nationally were in a pod. So our poll was right on track with what seems to be going on nationally. So this number, I didn't really know exactly what to expect, but I think probably I would have expected this to be a little higher, again, just because of the level of scrutiny and attention that pods received going into the year. Okay, so that was a pretty quick look at what parents are actually doing. So then how's it actually going? We asked the question basically, are they doing the best they can? Could they be doing much better? Could they be doing a little bit better? And found that overall, about half say the district is doing the best they can. That top line there, 57% say the same of the school. About 2/3, 67% say the same of the teacher. This follows a pretty well understood phenomenon in education polling where basically the closer to you and the closer to your child something gets, the better ratings you give it. You know, we've done many surveys over the years on education, and parents will give their own school better ratings than the district better ratings than the state better ratings than, you know, public schools around the country, and so forth. So there's definitely kind of a proximity effect taking place here. But overall, just looking at, you know, your child's own school and own teacher, it is a majority. There are still many parents that think the school could be doing some things better, but very few say much that they really ought to be doing much better. So overall, I'd say not bad marks, but certainly room for improvement. We then broke that down by parents in public, charter, Catholic, and private schools. I should say district public schools, charter, Catholic, and private, and found not huge variation, some level of variation there. Public, district, charter, and Catholic schools all there in the 50s. Private schools were rated as doing the best they can. Were the most likely for the parents there to say that they were doing the best they can. But overall, again, kind of roughly similar, not perfectly, not equal, but roughly similar levels of ratings there for public, charter, and Catholic schools. One of the other big questions was, how is tech being used? How well is tech being used? You know, of course, online and remote learning technology is such a big deal for education. This year, we just wanted to understand, how's your child doing? How's the teacher doing? How's the school doing? And found that about half say that their child is using remote learning technology very well. You know, that leaves a lot of people out. You know, there's a lot of parents who don't feel that their child is necessarily fully able to use remote learning technology very well. Comparing the types of school, it looks like private and Catholic school parents are a bit more likely to, private school parents are a bit more likely to give higher ratings to both the teacher and the school overall. Charter and Catholic give a bit higher ratings than district public schools do. So some interesting trends there, and certainly something to think about as we all kind of learn more about what the best ways are to deliver online instruction. There is a lot of concern about impact on the children themselves. This looks back at our last poll, and then also compares to this poll in terms of just the percentage of parents who think their child is now behind grade level. Basically, back in June, we asked, before the pandemic, was your child ahead, at, or behind grade level? Okay, well, how about now? And then in October, this last poll, we asked the same thing. So we basically have 3 time periods that we're comparing here. And we can see that that across all the groupings on this slide, there's a sharp increase in parents who think that their child is behind grade level, both from before the pandemic and really even from the end of last school year. Certainly, there are some differences in terms of the overall perception, in terms of the overall percentage of parents who think their children are now behind grade level. Black and Latino parents are, it looks like, about 8 or 10 points more likely than white and Asian parents to say that. And there's a difference in terms of income too, with parents at 100,000, with household incomes of $100,000 or greater are the least likely. Even so, none of these numbers are good. None of these numbers are what you'd want to see in terms of parent perception. Now, again, we're going to have to wait and see. You know, we'll have to wait and see what kinds of assessment data what assessment data reveals and what other kinds of data reveals as time goes on. This is only parent perception, but even so, you can see that it is increasing over time. So looking then at who thinks that their children are behind based on what format they're in, this is another place where where parents in a hybrid situation really stick out. So in each case, you've got overall 12% think their children were behind grade level before the pandemic. About 28% think that now. Your in-person parents with in-person in an in-person format are the least, have seen the smallest increase from 12 just to 17%. Remote parents, it's gone from 15 to 27. But then your biggest jump is that your hybrid parents there, where you've gone from 10% up to 31% of parents in a hybrid situation who think that their child is now behind grade level. Then one thing, though, that's very interesting is that the hybrid dynamic is not that parents think that school or the teacher or the district is doing something wrong at any higher level. It's not that they think, they're not blaming the school, they're not blaming the district, they're not blaming the teacher. In fact, they give kind of similar ratings, even perhaps a hair higher ratings than your remote only parents. Basically, these percentages are the ones who are the number who think that each one of these groups is doing the best they can. So For instance, looking all the way at the right, the teacher, hybrid parents, 73% of them think that the teacher is doing the best they can, 66% of remote parents, so very close there. Looking at the school, you've got 60% versus 57%. In each case, there's really not a lot of blame kind of being thrown at the school, even though hybrid parents are the most concerned about how their children are doing. I'd also say that, this is one point where it's worth it just to say this is all expectations, this is all perception, and people form perceptions in different ways and have different levels of expectations and, are doing different comparisons in their head as to what they should be getting or what their friends are getting or what their neighbors are doing and that sort of thing. So just something to keep in mind when you look at all these different numbers. In terms of the impact on children, we asked about 4 different impacts. These are paraphrased here, but the full wording on these and all the other questions is on our website at massincpolling.com. And I'd encourage you to go there. There's also a breakdown. All these breakdowns are in the crosstabs if you want to look at these or any others that are of particular interest to you. But basically what you can see here is in each case, it's about half or more who say that there's a negative impact on academic learning, mental and emotional health, basically the chance to build friendships and social and behavioral skills, compared to just about 20% or so who say it's had a net positive impact. And then there's 20 to 30% or so who say it hasn't made a difference. But when you're just comparing like who seems to be moving in the right direction versus going the perception that they're going backwards on these things, you can see that it's that many more think that there's a negative impact. So then the next few slides, what we're going to do is basically take the positives and subtract the negatives. So on balance, how is academic learning for different groups? On balance, how's mental and emotional health? So there's a few charts coming up, but I just wanted you to know that to kind of just take note for a second that these questions are what the next few slides are based on. It's your positives minus your negatives, because that helps us kind of figure out where people think that there are the most negative impacts. So subtracting the overall column there on the left, that's basically all parents, and you've got a net negative on academic learning if you subtract out your negatives from the positives of basically 29% or 29 points toward the negative. And then mental and emotional health, you've got basically net negative of 30% or 30 points. But then what you can do then is you can look across different demographic groups and just see who sees the impacts as the worst. This is another point where we should just remember that these are perceptions. You can see that when you just look at where the numbers are the lowest, you've got white parents and Asian parents are a bit lower than Black and Latino parents in terms of how they see the impacts on their children of the current academic year. And then upper income parents are also more negative, with your kind of 100,000 plus being the lowest or near the lowest on each one of the 4 measures. One of the things that does seem to make a difference, or that the data seems to suggest made a difference, is if you could do anything to kind of change the situation, it seemed to make a big difference. If you were in a pod, if you could hire anybody, if you could change schools. In each one of these cases, you saw that you can see that the net impact is positive on each one of these 4 things. Not hugely positive, but compared to basically people who are in a pod, that's the second column there, to people who are not in a pod, you can see the huge differences there in terms of the net impact that parents are perceiving. Same thing with if you were able to hire help, the net impact is somewhat positive, not hugely again, but at least somewhat, compared to your parents who have said that they did not hire any help. And changing schools is basically the same thing. So then we can then look at remote versus hybrid versus in person. Starting off, ignore the right for a second and just look at the first 3 columns. There you've got your net impact of parents who are in an in-person situation versus remote versus hybrid. First of all, in person, you see a pretty considerable net positive there. But then comparing your remote versus hybrid, which is what the vast majority of students in Massachusetts are doing at this point, you can see that hybrid, the impacts are perceived as being more negative, kind of adding to the evidence that we've been looking at throughout the survey. So then an obvious follow-up question is, well, is that just because of different people who are doing hybrid and different demographic groups who are doing hybrid versus doing remote? So what we did is ran a bunch of regressions, which we can leave aside for the moment, but it kind of confirmed what we then showed on this chart, which is that even if you look across different, we looked earlier between income groupings, we're now looking between race and ethnicity. White parents in hybrid are more negative than white parents in remote in terms of the impact. Latino parents whose children are in a hybrid situation perceive more negative impact. Same with Black parents, same with Asian parents. In each case, there's a deeper perception of that their child will be facing problems in hybrid than there is in remote. So I'd say that we don't have a full explanation for this, which is one of the reasons I'm very glad that we're doing focus groups. I'm very glad we're doing more surveys. We can say that based on the earlier data that that parents don't seem to be blaming the school. It's not like they're more upset than any other group with how the school or the teacher is performing, but it is consistent across demographic groups that hybrid seems to be given a lower rating than does remote schooling. So looking at a few other things then, looking at comparisons between June and October, one of the things we were able to compare was IEP services, basically who's getting it, who's not, and is it good enough? Starting with kind of the third set of bars in there, this is just the percent between June and October, June being your darker red bar there, who were not receiving IEP services. And you can see that that's gone from 27% of kids with an IEP down to 8% now. But if you then look back at the second set of bars, the number who say that the IEP services that they're receiving are inadequate has gone from 11% in June up to 27% today. So more students are getting them, but parents think that the more parents think that the services that they're getting are not adequate. This then looks at ELL services, basically using the same kind of format. And you can see, again, starting with the third set of bars, many fewer students say or parents, I should say that they're just not getting the services, period. But this one's actually moving in the other direction, where more parents now think that the ELL services that the child is getting are adequate. So IEP services, more getting them, doesn't really seem to be moving in the right direction, whereas ELL services, there's a big increase in the number who say that the services they're getting are adequate at this point. Another thing that has moved somewhat in the right direction is device access. Again, this is something that our poll back in May and June really looked at, and found that the students who weren't really able to engage with the class, the classwork that was offered at that point, tech access was a huge deal. It was a big thing that was really limiting students' ability to participate. And there was a lot of focus put on, trying to be sure that device access was improved. We can see that across almost every group on the slide, device access was improved, or at least held roughly steady. There's still some distance to go, looking at, for instance, parents under 50,000 where, now it's 80% say that their family has sufficient devices instead of 74%. That still leaves, about 1 in 5 families who don't have enough device access. And across each one of these groups, it just seems like this is one of the things that really has changed since May and June and now in October. Something that has moved a bit or I should say hasn't really improved and perhaps has moved slightly in the other direction is sufficient internet access. And I put stars around the word sufficient because, again, sufficient is just really, it's a very interesting concept. Do you have good enough internet means, in May and June, it meant, do you have good enough for whoever might be working at home? Do you have good enough internet that your students can, download the materials that they need? Now, as we'll see in a second, there's multiple hours per day of live classroom activities, particularly for your remote and hybrid students. So the demands on internet are much higher. So even if you have the same internet that you had back in May and June, it may have been good enough at that point and may not be good enough at this point. So looking at what parents are actually doing, what students are actually doing. This looks at remote students versus hybrid students. Those are the two columns. Basically, what's going on during the day? How many hours per day are students spending on each thing? And you can see that the very largest portion is live online classes. And there you see that it's over 70% who say it's at least 2 hours a day. With 44% in the case of remote only saying it's over 4 hours a day. And then much smaller amounts of time being spent on offline and coursework and pre-recorded material, but still quite a bit. So you can kind of get a sense from this of what the mix of time is that students are spending on each one of these activities. But looking then at what the at kind of one of the things that device access has clearly done is that it's let students participate more than they would have otherwise been able to. So the percentages on this one are what percentage of parents say their child is doing at least 2 or more hours a day attending live online classes. You can see that if you have enough devices, then that makes a big difference. 66% of those parents say their child is in online class at least 2 hours a day. If you have good enough internet, that also makes a difference. That's the middle two set of bars there. And then very interestingly, if you got a device from your school, that also seems to have made a very big difference, with 72% of parents who got some sort of device saying their child is doing at least 2 hours of online classes per day. So this is one, again, where device access has gone up, and it seems like where devices were received, that it really did make a difference for the students. So that is a very quick tour through what I know is a very dense data set. So we have time for questions. I see that there have been some already introduced into the chat. So if you want to go ahead and pose your questions, or I know Juana has been collecting them as well. Do we still have Juana? I'm not sure if we still have Juana. Oh, we do.
We do. I'm here, Steve. And thank you so much for walking us through that data. It does seem like we have a couple of great questions that people have put into the chat that we're really looking forward to posing to you to get your feedback and reaction. But before we do that, I just do want to remind people that MassINC is participating in an event coordinated by Brandeis University on December 1st. And it explores deeper the digital divide and strategies for solutions. So if you're interested in learning more about that research initiative in partnership with Brandeis Universities, feel free to follow MassINC on Twitter for more details. Now let's get to our audience questions. First, I want to start off with a comment, and this comment is by Bridget. She says, you've brought up some real great points around dissatisfaction in hybrid learning. She says, I'm not surprised parents have more concerns with the hybrid model, as hybrid students are likely learning through asynchronous or independent learning on their remote days. Steve, can you talk more about potential reasons why hybrid parents may be more dissatisfied?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think the commenter there hit on what is very possibly one of the big reasons. I've got elementary school kids of my own, and that is their situation in terms of hybrid. They're every other week in class and every other week completely asynchronous. So certainly that does seem like it both adds a burden to the parent, and also that off week. I think there's just a huge variation of what kids are actually getting or doing during that asynchronous week. That there it really does, I think, depend on who you might have to help, who you might have, what your child's situation is for that time. Another theory, which we'll have an opportunity hopefully to test as time goes on, is just the chaos factor. That it's a different thing for parents each day. For some parents, it's Monday and Tuesday they're in, then Wednesday no children are in, and then Thursday and Friday the other cohort's in. So there's just a different. It's the chaos factor. So those are kind of two of our current theories, but it's something that I really do hope that we're going to be able to dig more into.
Yeah, it must definitely cause some degree of disruption to a pattern, right, of what parents are trying to get their students and children kind of accustomed to, and not having that regularity, I assume, must cause some degree of of turbulence for the family in trying to meet the students' needs.
Yeah, and I mean that's exactly. And for those who those watching who don't necessarily have kids in the school district or schools or anything, very often if you're fully remote, then you're synchronous, meaning there's a teacher all the time. So even though you're at home, at least there is a format, a teacher, some kind of feedback mechanism and so forth. Whereas if you're hybrid, then there's not. Again, we didn't really dig into that, partially because there hasn't been a lot of polling on this, so we really didn't know that we were going to find this. Both the EdChoice and the Pew Research Center poll came out after we had already done the poll. So we didn't really like go into this thinking, okay, we really need to understand what the problems are with hybrid and why people are rating it so low, because we didn't know, so this is one of those things where I'm very happy we have more, kind of more to go, and more opportunity to dig into it.
Yeah, no, one of the things that I found really interesting, Steve, and in the data was the results in terms of who was initiating pods in their homes, and the fact that you saw very little difference between race and socioeconomic standing. And just because, as I think of my upbringing and being, coming from a working class household where parents were both working, I wonder if there was a degree of people not wanting to say no, right? Like, I'm not taking this on and supplementing my child's education, and wanting to say yes, that, yeah, they're doing everything they can. They're creating pods to ensure that their children are receiving, supplemental education. And I wonder if really, communities of color and underserved populations are really implementing pods to the same extent that our white counterparts are, just because based on, the socioeconomic challenges, the fact that people of color are frontline workers, it was surprising for me.
Yeah, one of the things that I've also that became clear in some of the background research we did for this, and is just that even within the term pod, there's infinite shades of what people might mean by that. Some people in news accounts use pod to basically mean our children are all in one place and we've hired a professional teacher who teaches them full time, and that's the full amount of school they're getting. They're not, they're enrolled in some other school at this point, basically. Whereas, other people for pods mean, our kids get together so that they can do synchronous learning in the same room just for socialization. Others might mean like one of the parents might be in the room with them, kind of helping them through the asynchronous parts, but there's just so many things that people mean. Like if you have a high schooler and they go over to a friend's house to do their work, is that a pod? So that's one of the notes I was making at the beginning, is that there are so many shades of gray that we tried to really capture it in as much detail as we could without asking 500 questions on format. But, there certainly is more, there are more possibilities in terms of shading what exactly parents are doing and what exactly kids are doing.
No, that's so great that you clarify that and we hone into it, because it has huge impacts in terms of what does academic learning look like for our students, right? The assessment of what's working and not working is really determined by what's happening for students across our Commonwealth. We then had a question from Julie, and her question was the following: based on these survey results, does the state's push for in-person services for all, as opposed to focusing on quality remote services and in-person services for highest need students, make sense as a route for improving equity for students?
That's the $1 million, $1 billion question, really, I think, is, we can ask parents kind of what they went through and what they are experiencing, but then the leap from there to what should we actually do about it that's a great question. It's, I think, beyond what we can necessarily take from the poll, but the things that we can say about it from the poll are, there's different steps between fully remote and fully in person, and just taking steps toward in person, if isn't necessarily what parents want, and it doesn't necessarily lead to higher parent reaction. So if you're going from remote to hybrid, that's in many parents' minds not a step in the right direction. It comes with the chaos factor. It comes with the asynchronous learning time. Again, those are just theories, but it basically, you're getting to hybrid, which is not necessarily a place where parents want to be. All of that being said, there's also the real question about, what will ultimately be the impact? What will be the learning impact? Will it be clear at the end that even though it was a miserable experience for parents, that hybrid really was better? That's the kind of thing which we don't really know yet. We don't know if it's going to turn out that, one of the learning models actually did produce better results. But if we're just listening to parents, there's a lot on their minds. I mean, it sounds almost trite to say at this point, but it's not only about one thing. Health and safety was the number one thing above academic considerations. And with cases spiking, I wouldn't be surprised if that number goes even higher in future rounds.
Thank you, Steve. We have another question here. How does satisfaction vary by grade level? And have you seen changes in satisfaction by grade level vary from the June survey to this fall?
That's a great question, and I'm hoping that Maeve can be looking at the crosstabs and perhaps either post that in the chat or pop on the video and tell us, just because I don't know off the top of my head. One of the things we did see in June was that technology challenges were much higher for younger grade levels. Parents were having to do much more with helping their kids in terms of just doing the stuff that they had to do at that point. But in terms of what the current impacts and satisfaction levels are, I don't know off the top of my head. But again, that's all on the website, and that's all at massincpolling.com.
Great. This is an interesting question. Have schools reduced academic expectations for their students this year? Do parents think schools are doing enough to challenge their children? What was your sense in the poll around this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they feel like the majority of them feel like the schools are doing the best they can. But that means a lot of different things. Like they're thinking about, it's not only about like maximizing academic challenge, it's also about keeping children safe from, infection, and, they have a whole bunch of different factors that are on their minds at this point. But when you look at the overall numbers of just, are they doing the best they can? The majority think they are. There's many who don't, but the majority do think that they're at least doing the best they can. It seems to be something more about the model itself when we're looking at particularly at hybrid, that we're seeing the impact on kids is negative, but it's not because the school is not doing what is being asked of them. They are doing the best they can. It's just that even despite that, the impact is still negative.
Well, you've been bringing up an interesting point, Steve, in your comments, which is, this is perception. This is in no way measuring learning, right, in a real way, and assessing what learning will look like at the end of the year. We may be surprised and see that hybrid actually yielded greater outcomes. But it also brings up the question about, are we going to do an assessment of our students' learning? And how would that look like in the midst of this turmoil where we're seeing the education format of learning changing, right, from the beginning of the year? And we're continuing to see COVID rates of infection increase. And you're bringing up an important point, like this is perception, real time, people responding to an ongoing crisis. But how do we assess the impacts of learning this year moving forward? And I think there are some real challenges in light of what you've been able to share today.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that we want to be able to look at also in future research is just what parents think should be done. I know that there's kind of active and ongoing discussions in the policy community about what should be done in terms of assessments and how should we figure out what the impact was on students. But what parents think, that's another issue that I'm hoping we'll be able to cover in future surveys.
That's great. We have a question from Tracy Novick. She says, any comments on baseline versus say last year when kids were in school full time like normal? Do we know satisfaction then?
No, to be honest, none of the questions that we've asked in here are ones that we have long-term trends on. That's a great question, and they're probably, they're thinking about it off the top of my head. There probably are questions or surveys that have been running long enough that, like, Gallup does one of K-12 parents that's been running for a long time, for instance, where they probably have repeated some of the measures. The ones that we've been doing this year have only been done this year, so we don't really have anything that could show kind of a discontinuity or anything like that specific to Massachusetts.
Great. One of the interesting points in the data that you were sharing today, Steve, was the impacts. And there were more significant impacts in terms of white parents reporting on their students' mental or emotional health. Have we learned anything about how schools are doing to try to meet the needs of social emotional needs of our students in the school year, and how effective parents think our schools are doing in that area?
Yeah, that's one where I found the where the whole idea that this is perception and expectation to be very kind of poignant and pertinent, which is, parent, it's both, it relates both to what you've experienced in the past and what your child has experienced in the past, and whether that was positive or negative. So is staying home in some way more positive just because they're not dealing with things that they were dealing with before? That's one where kind of the experience could differ. And then what do parents think should be happening at school, and how much short of what they're seeing is that falling? These are all the ways which I think perception and expectation um, really kind of shapes how the survey responses came back. I mean, what exactly schools are doing, I'm sure that there are better reports than just kind of looking at it from the parent standpoint on that. But in terms of the parent standpoint, I think it really is molded by their own experience and their child's own experience.
I agree 100%. When I look at the Black and Latino numbers, it's, had you asked my parents, they would have been like emotional and mental health. I mean, is that something the school should be even leading on? So I think there's a lot that has to do with their perception, their lived experiences, and their expectations of what an education looks like. I think we're coming close to time, Steve. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up. Any key takeaways or thoughts?
Well, I want to encourage people also to attend the future forum that's Ben Foreman's going to be talking about the digital divide. Obviously, we have some updated numbers on that in here, and you can see just from the very last slide how important that's been in being able to connect some students to things they may not have otherwise been able to access. So this is part of an ongoing series of research, both in terms of polling and what MassINC has been doing. And we're really looking forward to being able to dig in more on the issues we were not able to cover as a part of this poll.
Thank you, Steve. And that is all the time we have today. Thank you to everyone who tuned in. Do please keep an eye out for future events like this. The MassINC Polling Group has and continues to put out meaningful findings on Massachusetts residents during this pandemic, and there will be more polls like this to come. If you missed any of today's event, it is being recorded and it will be available at massincpolling.com, as will the details from the poll. Thank you again to the Bar Foundation for sponsoring this poll, and thank you to our audience for being here with us today. Have a great afternoon.